Friends, what I'm going to show you is the report that I presented for the International Bioethics Committee, joint meeting with the Commission for the Ethics of Science and Technology. So this is the final report that we prepared, but it's based on previous reports. So it's called the Ethical Principles for Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation. Okay. So this is based on 4 reports from 2010 to 2013. The first one is the Ethical Principles of Global Climate Change, which was made in Malaysia. And then the Ethical Framework for Climate Change Policies, which we approved in Qatar 2011. Then the statement of issues relevant to consideration of the desirability of preparing a declaration on ethical principles in relation to climate change. This was prepared for the General Conference of UNESCO in Paris. And then the fourth one is the background for a framework of ethical principles and responsibilities for climate change adaptation, which we prepared in Bratislava. The last one is on adaptation because of the political climate at the time. We couldn't do mitigation. As you know, member states are meeting in Paris this December, and we are going to do mitigation. But it was very difficult to get to the mitigation 2 years ago. So what we did is to do the ethics of adaptation. So these documents are available in the UNESCO website. If you just look at the social and human sciences sector, you will get all these documents. So what I'm going to present is the latest document. Just 2 months ago, we approved the final document on the ethical principles of climate change. And we have identified 10 principles. There are other principles, I will mention them as we go along. But these are the 10 that we have identified that are necessary for adaptation and mitigation. So we're going to present this again at Conference of Parties in December. So before the Conference of Parties, this will be presented. And also next month, during the World Philosophy Day, we will do ethical principles of the Global South. This is more for UNESCO in general. So we have identified biological diversity, cultural diversity, solidarity of life on Earth, respect for the intellectual solidarity of humankind, global justice, resilience, sustainability, the precautionary principle, the duty to share scientific knowledge, and the integrity of scientific research. So these are the 10. Now, these 10 principles are integrated in a system with global justice at the center. So you have diversity and solidarity, the first 2 general principles. Under diversity, you have biological and cultural. Under solidarity, you have solidarity of life on Earth and solidarity of humankind. Now, if you put together diversity and solidarity, which means different species, for example, biological diversity, and an ecological niche, then you have the relationship between species and the niche. So it's not, diversity is not so much having a lot of species. It's the relationship between the individuals or members of the species and the ecological niche. So diversity is really a system. It's a system of relationships. So it's systemic, it's complex. So those of you who have done their physics, complexity means when you do something in one part of a system, the whole system is affected. And sometimes the effects are unintended. So, for example, in climate change, when industrialization emerged, they did not intend to pollute. They intended to create wealth. and to distribute it. So it's very difficult to put blame on individual actors, because when people put exhaust in the atmosphere, the exhaust gets mixed up, and you don't really have a tag that this is an American air, or this is a Filipino carbon dioxide. They all get mixed up, and so you don't have any individual to blame, but everyone is in this project. Everyone is involved. So that's what we mean by complexity. Now, how do you create a theory of justice based on a situation where you don't have individual responsibility, because it's a collective responsibility, it's all of humankind. So it's very difficult, for example, that principle of differentiated responsibilities, because how do you differentiate something that's all mixed up? So how do you count responsibility? That's the whole problem of the Kyoto Protocol. They couldn't count. And that's the whole problem why all these protocols fail, because the measurements are very subjective, and you cannot say because we are affected, we are the ones destroyed, you should pay us. How much are you going to pay? How depends on how much you put into the air, but you don't know how much they. Because when they put something in the air, it's the effect of the combination of these different pollutants. It's not any one pollutant, it's the combination. That's what we mean by complexity. In complexity science, the energy is fixed and they must go somewhere, but they produce problems eventually. So that's the kind of problem we're trying to address, and that's what we are going to. That's what we're trying to solve, for example, in this conference of parties in Paris in December. So what we are trying to propose now is that a justice, if you're going to talk about justice on the global scale, not just the national or individual, but on the global scale, it would have to be a more dynamic theory of justice. It cannot be, for example, a static world order. Whose order? Because whenever you say order, then there is disorder created somewhere else. That's just physics. In thermodynamics, if you create a system, there is chaos somewhere that's produced. For example, we see this in Syria, we see this in Rohingya, we see this in all these stateless people. When the unintended consequence is that you have chaos somewhere else. You want to impose order in Syria, you want to impose order in, say, Bangladesh. Then you create disorder in the oceans. People have to migrate, or disorder in the melting ice caps. Then you have emerging the problem of people, island nations. So this is the kind of justice that we are interested in, kind of justice that will be reflective in the sense that it doesn't mean that it cannot be done. It doesn't mean just because it cannot be measured, you cannot have a theory of justice. It just means that your theory must be more complex. It just means that we trace our actions all the way back to the person who initiated the action. Because in normal science, in the science that we know, for example, in modern science that we know, you have hypotheses and then you do an experiment. But the logic in that kind of science is linear. You have a cause and then an effect. But in complexity science, your cause can go back to you. When you throw garbage, then you will create floods, and the flood, and no one is exempted from the flood. So, in other words, when we calculate or when we think about justice, we have to think all the way to the effect of that action to the one who initiated it. It's like the Buddhist theory of karma. eventually it will go back to you. So, but that's not just philosophy. It's also physics. That energy is fixed, and you cannot get out of it. Eventually, it will affect us. So I think that's a more reflective kind of justice, but it's also equilibrating, meaning to say that the measurement will be shifting. It's not fixed because of precisely the complexity and the combination of pollutants that happens. So this is a very difficult project, but I think it's doable. It's very easy to blame others in a linear form of justice. And I think in an equilibrating theory of justice, you do not blame others because everyone is affected, everyone's positive. By the very fact that we exist, we pollute, we exhale carbon dioxide. So we are all in this together. So let me then show how this global justice is related to the other concepts. The stakeholders, in terms of psychological and social structures of individuals and collectives, nations, corporations. The sustainability of future generations, that's how we define sustainability, that the future generations will still have something to work with. The precautionary principle in terms of the vulnerable communities, the ones who are, we call them now vulnerable instead of talking about poverty. So we have shifted since 2009 in Malaysia, we shifted the language from economics to ecology. The language of economics is poverty, the language of ecology is vulnerability. So the precautionary principle is applied there. When there is potential harm, then it is the duty of the one who is initiating that harm to prove that it will not really redound to hurting other people. But that's really a problem in terms of equilibrating dynamics, because how far is the harm? But what we have to think about is that the harm should always be traced back to the one who initiated it, so that they will become responsible. That's the only way that they can become responsible. Otherwise, they don't care about. It's very difficult to say. For example, in bioethics, you have the principle of do not harm, or care ethics. It's very difficult to say if care ethics or do not harm others if you do not know the extent of that harm, or if you're not going to be harmed yourself. So we have to go all the way to the one who will initiate a new kind of technology, for example. And then in terms of science, and we're talking about climate science and indigenous science, the integrity of the practice of science, and the collaboration of science, not only in terms of expert knowledge, but also indigenous and local knowledge. So how do we put them together? So let me go through it one by one. So by diversity, we mean these are all United Nations definitions. The variability among organisms and other ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This principle upholds not only the importance of individual species that I was talking about, and their unique environments as elements that constitute the web of entities that support life on Earth, and this is the important line, but also emphasizes the critical distinction and importance of the combination of life forms, and the important word is combination, and their interactions, again the word interaction, with each other and with the rest of the environment that has made Earth a uniquely habitable place for humans. So just as damage is complex, so the emergence of life is also complex. What made it possible for humans to emerge are the oxygen-producing organisms and plants. So we are interrelated. So the fact that I'm able to think today is because of the oxygen produced by leaves. So now the equilibrating dynamics means, from a holistic point of view, the more important key to the survival of individuals and their environments lies in maintaining and sustaining the diversity of relationships between species and their ecosystems. It is the equilibrating dynamics between species and systems, rather than the mere diversity of organisms and species, that make the difference between the eventual demise or survival of organisms and their species. So what is important here is the concept, for example, of a robust kind of ecological niche. An ecological niche is robust or strong if there are more networks, if there are more relationships inside the ecological niche. It's not so much there are many species there, but it's the relationship that supports the whole niche or the system. So now this is reflected in not only the organisms, but also in terms of intellectual life. In other words, when we exchange ideas, we enrich each other by exchanging those ideas. We produce better ideas because of debate, because of exchange. The intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind is enshrined in UNESCO's constitution in terms of the cooperation of the peoples of the world. And peoples of the world must be emphasized. It's not just nation states. And is particularly relevant to the challenges of global climate change, since it implicates the fate and destiny of humanity beyond national boundaries, gender, age, and ethnicities. The effects of environmental degradation are felt not only by the weakest and most vulnerable groups, but by everyone who must rely on the life-giving powers of the earth in order to survive and flourish. Now, global justice in relation to climate change requires the participation of all members of human society, regardless of their contribution to the problem. The unique worldviews that different cultures and peoples bring to the arena of discourse will certainly enrich the pool of ideas and resources that can be harnessed towards finding solutions to this global problem. That's what we mean by complexity. The more people participate, the stronger the argument will be. So resilience is associated with the development of strategies that promote procedures and systems that lead individuals and communities to optimize the resolution of climate-related disasters through self-organization and feedback mechanisms at various levels of society. Resilience is linked with the use of traditional or local knowledge and experience of past natural or technological catastrophes. For example, here in the Philippines, we know that in Batanes, for example, up north, where typhoons always pass through, they build their houses so that it will not be destroyed. In my own region, in Bicol, where typhoons also pass, we know how to deal with it. We know that when trees get cut, then we just merely utilize them for building new fences, or the kind of plants that we plant would be root crops and not rice, because rice will be flooded. So these are adaptation mechanisms, but also makes you survive in climate change or in climate change. So in terms of climate change, sustainability means discernment of the Earth's carrying capacity and continuity of regenerating enough resources for the sake of future generations and the vulnerable sectors of society. I will have more to say about that later. The precautionary principle means that when human activities may lead to morally unacceptable harm that is scientifically plausible but uncertain, actions shall be taken to avoid or diminish that harm. Instances of moral unacceptability were identified as threatening to human life or health, serious and effectively irreversible, inequitable to present generations, or imposed or even future generations, or imposed without adequate consideration of the human rights of those affected. Now, this human rights is also now being used as another principle. We have problems with human rights because it's not just human rights, it's the rights of the system and other animals and others. Duty to share scientific knowledge. The dissemination of scientific information among the vulnerable groups, therefore, is a matter of human rights in terms of enhancing not only the material conditions of existence, but also of the intellectual and indivisible heritage of humankind. The transfer of scientific knowledge and technology can be made more effective if vulnerable populations who are exposed to similar risks and threats can have access to share and aggregate their best practices on climate change adaptation and mitigation. Of course, there are indigenous knowledge that, for example, when certain animals move in a certain way, then indigenous peoples know that there's a typhoon coming. But that's only within the ambit of their experience. And the problem is, how do you explain this to others? Or how do you supplement this with science, with radars and with actual Doppler kinds of the water, measuring the rainfall, just to make it more precise. So the integrity of scientific research. Climate science also faces some specific challenges to its claim of integrity. Because of its societal importance, climate science and climate scientists are under constant public scrutiny to reveal internal procedures, communications among scientists, and the level of consensus in the scientific community. The society can expect climate scientists to follow the highest standards of scientific and research integrity, but it also has a duty to protect the integrity of climate scientists when they are criticized for ideological or non-scientific reasons. Okay, let me then conclude. This list of ethical principles identified by COMES are certainly not exhaustive, but they are available as bridges that can close the gap between the processes of moral deliberation on the one hand and the actual decisions that must be made in relation to the wicked problem of climate change. The complexity of the reality of climate change requires equally complex responses that entail the cooperation of stakeholders across the various levels and sectors of the global community. Climate science, however, can account for these complex scenarios by tracking down the unintended consequences of anthropogenic action on the environment as far as possible. Now, this is now the state of climate change in Paris. No? Each nation is trying to determine what's called INDC, the intended nationally determined contribution that they will have to mitigate, to reduce their pollution. To climate change adaptation and mitigation that are currently being prepared and submitted to the UNFCCC by nation states for the next Conference of Parties on Climate Change next month in Paris. Obviously falls within the ambit of ethics by the very nature of its voluntary and collaborative commitments. So before, we don't know how to determine how much mitigation you will have. But now it's voluntary. Each country will determine for itself how much they will reduce. But because it's voluntary, then it is ethical. You're responsible for the choices that you make. So when you make a voluntary contribution, then you made a choice. Then you can be held responsible. Then people can say, you're the one who stated this. You're the one who said you will reduce this much. Why are you not fulfilling your commitments? So it's now measurable. So it will be launched this month, November 19th. So we're going to Paris for World Philosophy Day and launch this global environmental ethics of the Global South. And one of the principles that is emerging, and I think this was really discovered here in Asia when COMES came to Malaysia, is the principle of frugality. And while doing research on this, I noticed that this is a principle for Islam in terms of water. The Hadith and the Quran talks about frugality in terms of water. water is very important for our work. Water is also important, a very important metaphor for Taoism. And for Taoism, frugality is one of the three most important virtues. So for both the Arab, the Middle East and Asian worldview, frugality will be very important. So frugality means, as a practical principle, balances the levels of consumption and production so that wastes are reduced to a minimum, while the extraction of resources is limited to the replenishing capacity of nature. Ecological footprints are then reduced so that ecological niches are not extended beyond their carrying capacities. So you have many practices of frugality in Asia, for example. I noticed when I was visiting Japan, the family that I lived with would not buy anything that they will not be able to consume for the day. Even if they have refrigerators, the groceries are just nearby. But unlike us, for example, after a while, your refrigerator is filled with so many things that sometimes they stink already. But it's because we don't really take care of what we buy. We buy only what we can consume. Just because there's a refrigerator doesn't mean that you will save or you will have too many things in the refrigerator. Actually, especially for myself, I live by myself, so it's more expensive to cook. For example, for me, because you have to buy all these ingredients, and then it's a waste after a while. So it's better to just eat out and get a good place where they cook well also. But this frugality is an emerging concept, I think. It's linked with sustainability also. So these are some of the concepts that we have identified. I'm sure there are more. And we are continuing to identify concepts, especially coming from the Global South. We have identified already several that will be for another presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ibana.